I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Ori Nir, and with me is my colleague, Max Albert Deitch.
Hello.
And so we're going to go ahead and start. We scheduled this webinar before the recent round of hostilities. Over the weekend, I was concerned that come Thursday, come today, the topic we're discussing today may seem irrelevant to the news or something like that. But the news cycle in Israel moves very fast, faster than any place else I know in the world. And so the weekend's war is yesterday's news, so to speak, and we can go back and discuss a different aspect of the occupation today. I do want to refer, though, to the Gaza hostilities of the weekend and refer you, our viewers, to a statement that we issued in real time during the fighting. You can find it on our website, to some policy commentary that I posted on our website yesterday, and to social media posts that express our deep concern about the suffering on both sides of the Gaza border. I particularly wanted to acknowledge the suffering of the Gaza Strip civilian population, and particularly the children, who are actually half of the Gaza population because it's such a young population. We hope to devote an actual webinar to this issue of the state, the situation on the ground in Gaza, and particularly the psychological state of the children in Gaza. So hopefully coming soon. I noted earlier that we're focusing today on a different aspect of the occupation, and what I mean by that is that when we think of the occupation, the first thing, the first image that comes to mind typically is an armed soldier facing a Palestinian civilian. But in fact, most Palestinians actually experience the occupation not through that kind of interaction, but rather through the bureaucracy of the Israeli authorities that they have to deal with. And that is the topic of our webinar today. Before I introduce our guest and we start the conversation, the two housekeeping notes, which if you're a regular, you're probably familiar with them by now. This webinar is recorded. You'll be able to view the video on YouTube and listen to the audio on our podcast, Peacecast. The second note is that you're invited and actually encouraged to ask questions. Do that using the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen. And please keep your questions short because we are reading them, looking through them as we do the webinar in real time, and we don't have the ability to process long questions or statements. And now, after this rather long introduction, it's time to actually introduce our guest. His name is Joel Carmel, and he's joining us from his home in Jerusalem. Joel, or I understand that his friends call him Jojo, was born and raised in London. He made Aliyah in 2011. He was drafted to the Israeli military, the IDF, in Israel, and served in the unit known as the Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT. He'll explain to us soon what COGAT is, and was posted as an officer in the Jenin district of the West Bank. It's the Jenin District Coordination and Liaison Office of the Civil Administration. And you're beginning to understand that we're talking bureaucracy here. There's a lot of red tape involved. As I said, Joel he lives in Jerusalem and works at the anti-occupation organization Breaking the Silence as the organization's English content coordinator. The reason we asked him to join us is that he's one of many young Israelis who served in the civil administration and gave testimonies about their service for the new report that Breaking the Silence just issued about the way in which the occupation authorities use their power to rule Palestinians, bureaucratically use the power to rule Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Joel actually translated that report into English. So again, apologies for this long introduction, Joel. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ori. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So Just to get you know better, Joel, what made you move to Israel 11 years ago, and how did you end up finding yourself in COGAT?
Well, as you said, I grew up in London. I was kind of brought up in the heart of the Jewish community there. My father's a rabbi, so I was always very involved in synagogue life, but also through the Jewish school I went to and the youth movements I went to, Noam and Bnei Akiva, which are conservative and orthodox. I think all around I was given the message that my job was to defend Israel, whenever that was necessary. And that meant that whenever there was some kind of attack on Israel, or whenever, in the media there was criticism, then me and my friends felt that it was our obligation to be the first ones outside the Israeli embassy with our flags, the people who were there to put Israel's point across. And at a certain point as a teenager, I kind of felt that I began to feel that it wasn't enough just being on the sidelines. And I really felt that Israel was home. I always had felt that way, and I still do, obviously. So it made sense to me that when I could, which was after I finished secondary school, I would make Aliyah. I would officially immigrate to Israel, and that's what I did. I came with a suitcase, and I studied in a yeshiva, a Jewish seminary, for a while. And then very quickly, I found myself, like with all other Israelis, a lot of other Israelis my age, drafting to the IDF.
So just to make sure that we are all familiar with the system and the terms that we're using, can you talk a little bit about what COGAT is and what the civil administration is and sort of how that works?
Yeah, so I'll say that, first of all, for medical reasons, I wasn't drafted as a combat soldier, and then my options were very reduced, and I was COGAT was only one of very few options that I had. And so I went for it because it sounded kind of interesting. COGAT, as was said before, stands for Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories. And that's basically a large unit that's within the Defense Ministry, actually, but also within the army. So it's kind of got two bosses, the Defense Minister and the IDF Chief of Staff. And basically it's an umbrella unit for two very influential and important units. One that works in the West Bank, called the Civil Administration, and one that works in Gaza or next to Gaza, called the Gaza DCL, District and Coordination Liaison Office. And those units are responsible for managing the day-to-day of the occupation. And that means, actually, maybe I'll share my screen. 1 second. I'll be able to show you what that looks like in practice. Can you see that?
Yes, yeah. We can see it.
So this is, I hope you're able to see, because the letters are quite small, but this is basically a chart that shows the various responsibilities of the civil administration. We've put the Gaza DCL in the corner there, but it has something of a similar structure as well. But you can see the kind of things that the civil administration deals with: agriculture, trade and industry, welfare, water, population registry, health, all of these things, which any kind of a random person looking at this might think, okay, this is like a government. This does all of the functions of, or almost all the functions of, a regular government. And obviously the big difference between this and my government or your government is that it's run by the military, which means that no one has a vote. Well, the people, I'll clarify that, the people who this government rules over, the Palestinians in the West Bank, don't get any kind of say in how this is run or representation themselves. And that means that what we're left with is a military regime which has been controlling millions of people in the West Bank and in Gaza for decades now, and it's run by soldiers and officers. So that's a very short introduction to our unit.
And I understand, Joel, that each one of those branches, agriculture, trade and industry, transport, and so on and so forth, is an extension of a government ministry in Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's important to say that what you see below at the bottom of the chart is the various regional branches: Jenin, DCL, Ephraim, DCL, Nablus, and so on. I was posted in Jenin, right here in the bottom left-hand corner, but lots of these other branches are manned by civilians, not people in uniform, but they are employed by the IDF. They're called Ezrachim of Dei Tzahal, basically IDF employees who are civilians, and they're representatives of the various Israeli government ministries, and they're sent to serve in the civil administration, basically to put the policies of those various offices into practice as far as the West Bank is concerned. And that's how we get basically a kind of mishmash between civilian and army, and it's all kind of run by the person who's in charge is the head of the civil administration, is a Tat Aluf. I can't remember exactly what that rank translates to, maybe
Brigadier General, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that person is under the that person's commander is the head of the central command, which is the person who's in charge of the whole West Bank, both for the security purposes, so to speak, and the civil administration. And what that basically means is the head of the central command, who is a general, is but more or less the prime minister or the president of the West Bank, in that this person officially has sovereignty over the whole area, and the unit that carries out the policy is the civil administration.
Got it. So with all that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the report, which focuses on the permit regime that the occupation authorities in the West Bank and Gaza use. What one could say, what's wrong with the permit regime? Like, any citizen or subject of any country, any government needs permits and licenses to function in a society. And issuing these permits is one of the prerogatives of any government. So what is special about the nature in which, in the way in which the Israeli authorities use that tool, the permits?
Okay, so it's a good question, and we've heard that kind of as criticism a few times. Why is this even an issue that you feel that you need to deal with in breaking the silence? And it's true, we're all none of us like bureaucracy, and none of us like having to stand in line and apply for permits. The difference is when I stand in line at the Interior Ministry in Israel to get my ID card or my passport, the person who is serving me is an employee of my government, which means that in the worst case scenario, let's say I don't like that person or the way that I'm treated, I can complain, or I can say there's a problem with the policy, and my at the very least, at the next election, which in Israel happens a lot, I can vote for the other guy, which is, the very most basic thing that we have in a democracy. In the West Bank, there's no democracy. It's not a democratic place. And that means that the person serving, as I said, as a soldier, it will be me or one of the soldiers who was with me. And that means that if you have a problem with the way you're served, then you don't really have anywhere to go. You don't have anyone to complain to. There is a very complicated complaints process, and mostly it's people who aren't granted the permits that they have the right to, and then they have to go with a lawyer in most cases if they want to be successful. But the fact that the people who are doing this are not civilians also has other implications, like the fact that, you know, we're doing it as teenagers, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, who most of the time don't speak Arabic. I didn't really speak Arabic. I went through a very fast course and I wasn't really able to pick it up, which means that I couldn't properly communicate with the people who came and gave in their applications, people who needed specific things. I wasn't necessarily able to understand them. And generally, this kind of bureaucracy doesn't really belong in day-to-day. It shouldn't belong in the kind of regime that we're dealing with. That's why we believe in breaking the silence that there's not really a way to do this without ending the occupation properly, because as long as the representation is given by military, it's not going to be democratic.
So on that subject of representation and looking at how those government components work, there's a question in the Q&A that I think might speak to this really well. Are any of those components headed by Palestinian people?
I find it very, very hard to believe that there would be a Palestinian in charge of anything. There probably are Palestinian employees of the civil administration, but as I said, it's a military body, and therefore the orders come from above. Our job is to carry out the policy that's set by the Israeli government. So it's you know, Israelis get a vote in who gets to control that policy, and the Palestinians don't. And in the very best case scenario, there'd be maybe some very low-level employees of this system. But even as a soldier, I had very little ability to have sway or to steer the direction of that policy, because my job as a soldier was to carry out orders.
So one of the things that the report points to in great detail is the way in which the regime, the permit regime, is being abused in order to solidify Israel's control, Israel's occupation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting subject, because I think the word abused, it makes sense here in this case, because I'll explain it first and then we'll talk about the abuse. We have built into the system something called, we translated it as compradors. It's not a very commonly used word. Others have translated it as interlocutors, but in Hebrew they're called bnei siach, and that's basically a whitewashed term for collaborators. And what we as a civil administration have an interest in doing is trying to bring Palestinians on board to share information with us about all sorts of things that are going on the Palestinian street, so to speak. And we have an interest in gathering that information. And because the permit system is so important, you think about how you need permits in order to visit relatives in Israel, which are often first circle direct relatives. You need permits in order to find work and go to work, which a lot of Palestinians are wholly dependent on the Israeli economy for their jobs. You need permits for medical treatment a lot of the time that you can't get in the West Bank and so on. All sorts of things that you would really need permits for. You're going to look for a way to make that process easier for you. And Israel obviously knows that. We, the civil administration, are completely aware of the fact that this is something that's very sought after. So we use that in order to bring people in to give us something that we want. And in exchange, we give them and their friends and their families permits. Now, that kind of sounds I don't know, for some people that might sound like, okay, on its face, something that every power will use in order to further its interests. But I think it's really important to think about what this means for Palestinian society. You have basically a two-tier society that we are creating as, the occupying power. We're creating the top tier, which are the people who are, they're connected to us. They're the ones who are getting all of this good treatment and VIP status. We even call it VIP status. And the other tier, which is everyone else who has to wait in line, who's very frustrated, who doesn't have trust in the top tier, who are the elites. And then what that does naturally is that it tears Palestinian society apart to make it very, very difficult for them to build something. And that, again, that serves our interests, that people don't trust each other.
So the permits actually are used as a kind of a carrot and stick tool to better rule the civilian population, right?
Yeah, so that's why I wanted to comment on the word abused, because this is something that's built into the system. It's not, we built the system of using the permits for this purpose. And I think the carrot and the stick analogy is also something that we're very aware of, because this is something that I really thought about at one point in my service, when I was just kind of this wasn't planned, or it wasn't something that was part of my job, but I found myself joining a mission of combat soldiers in the middle of one night, soldiers who were posted on my base, who were doing what's called a mapping mission in a town or a village next to Jenin, a Palestinian village. And in a mapping mission, you go into a town or a village, and you go into people's houses, and you are basically trying to get information about that house, but you do it by waking everyone up in the middle of the night and taking everyone's kind of information, and often there's a search or taking pictures or kind of a short interrogation. And that was a very difficult moment for me, because I saw how, we're waking up children in the middle of the night just to do something which for us is a small, easy process, and it's not because they're suspected of anything. They're innocent in mapping missions. And then, this was in the middle of the night, as I said, came back to base at something like 2 o'clock in the morning. And then at 8 o'clock in the morning, I opened the reception window where Palestinians were supposed to come to apply for their permits. And I realized that this is basically the two arms of the occupation, the more combat side, where, you go into the houses, you set up the checkpoints, you do arrests. And there's the bureaucratic side, where you demand that people stand in line and wait for the permits that you enforce on these people in order to live their day-to-day life.
Right. I think we got stuck a little bit there, kind of frozen. So we're going to wait until your internet connection picks up. I'll tell a story while we're waiting for it. I think that I actually witnessed and covered, when I was a reporter in the West Bank back in the 80s during the first Intifada, how the civil administration started perfecting that tool, the carrot and stick, as a tool to further the control of the population. What was happening was that there were some, violent, or not always violent, demonstrations, and during that time, the civil population around the activists on the ground, around the operatives, was joining and giving them backing. And at some point, a civil administration official, a senior civil administration official, told me, we are using, the barrel of the gun to deal with the violent demonstrators. but we're using the stamp and the ink in order to deal with those people around them who are supporting them. So I see, Joel, that you had to re-log in order to.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
Sorry
that's
about
fine.
that.
That's fine. I was just telling a story about how I actually witnessed what I think was the beginning of the process of using bureaucracy in order to as a kind of a carrot and stick tool during the first Intifada.
Mhm.
So okay, Max, do you want to go ahead and ask the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the way in which this permit regime is used in specifically the Gaza Strip. And I'm asking this both because Gaza has been in the headlines recently, as we were talking about earlier, but also because many people believe that Gaza's no longer occupation. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that, you know, all people talk about all the time. You know, Gaza is we left in 2005, and it's not under occupation anymore. I think people would do well to spend one day in the job that I was in before I went to officers training course and then was posted in Jenin. But before that, I was on the Gaza DCL base, which is on the border, the northern border of the Gaza Strip. And in our office, we dealt with all of the same permit structure that we had in the civil administration. We control completely all of the movement of people in and out of Gaza, apart from a small amount who managed to get out through Egypt, but we control most of the movement and the movement of goods in and out of Gaza, which means, you know, we controlled to the level of how many trucks of each kind of food are able to go in and out every day. That's something that we have to approve, as well as, you know, other imports and exports. And that's just one of the aspects. We also control the sea space. You know, we can, at our will, we can allow fishermen to go further from the shore or bring them closer to the shore, and we impose that blockade from the sea using our navy, and we control the airspace and the electromagnetic space. So really everything is under our control in that sense. And we can see that in the way that we carry out our Gaza policy. We kind of, as one of the testimonies which I gave in the booklet says, we feel that we have to keep Gaza on a very, very short leash, which means that, you know, every couple of years, every so often, we go in for a military bombardment, a full military campaign. But between those campaigns, we also have all of these restrictions, and we are basically controlling Gaza. The only difference is we use a remote control. We're not any longer in the Gaza Strip itself. We stand on the border and we really control everything about what and who goes in and out.
Joel, there are a few questions in the Q&A that are kind of nuts and bolts questions, but I think they're important because people want to better understand how, you know, the machinery of it. So maybe I'll ask them. Let's do a little kind of a ping pong, if it's okay with you, and kind of short questions, short answers. Question: when you're working, do you wear your IDF uniform? So this obviously applies to conscripted soldiers. Regular duty soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, I wore a uniform, I had a gun. I was a soldier, an officer for all intents and purposes.
Got it. Are translators available to ensure that soldiers who do not speak Arabic, like yourself, can communicate with the civilians?
Not translators per se. There are some soldiers who either come from a Druze background or happen to know Arabic who serve in the unit, but it's not kind of something that they make a special effort that every soldier who doesn't speak Arabic has an Arabic speaker next to them, it's you're lucky. Either you're lucky or you're not.
Okay, and another question that is not such a small, kind of nuts and bolts question, but is a little more deep and probably requires a little more explanation. Does the civil administration operate in areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority, areas A and B, where the Palestinian Authority rules?
Yeah, so most of the civil administration's business deals with Area C, okay, which is under the IDF's full control. That's true. In areas A and B, though, we have a lot of kind of roundabout control. We, for example, something that's been in the news recently, and I think there's an organization called COGAT, which is dealing with this right now, is the permits for Palestinians to enter and exit the West Bank go through us, the civil administration. And because most of the Palestinians live in areas A and B, that means that, in practice, that gives us, the civil administration, a lot of control over areas A and B. For example, the issue of university lecturers. Universities obviously operate by having kind of an exchange of ideas with lecturers who come from abroad and go abroad. And recently, Israel has announced a lot of restrictions on lecturers who can come into Palestinian universities, to the extent that, Israel's basically monitoring now what content, each particular lecturer can teach in order to determine whether that person would be allowed to be employed in a university in areas A and B. That's just one example.
Got it. Let's see. There's a question here which actually relates to something a little broader, and that has to do. So the question is, in your experience, have these permits, does the permit regime help the IDF identify terrorists? And so, if you can answer this question specifically, particularly, but maybe then zoom out a bit, broaden the scope, and talk about the synergy, the interaction between the civil control or the civil aspect of Israel's occupation and the military one, the one that deals with counterterrorism and things like that.
Okay, so the civil administration uses a computer system which has all of the Palestinians' details on the database, okay? And when Palestinians apply for permits, one of the stages that they have to go through is Shin Bet approval, which Shin Bet is the General Security Service. I mean, a lot of people are fine and they don't, they're approved more or less automatically, but some people, actually a lot of people, are not. And the Shin Bet has what's called bans on many Palestinians, and we learned from the testimonies here that the bans can apply to someone who has carried out a terror attack. A terror attack can be, anything from something very extreme, like, I don't know, blowing oneself up, or, well, then they wouldn't need a permit, I suppose, but all the way to, I don't know, throwing stones or doing something which a soldier has deemed to be not appropriate, and then that becomes a reason to ban someone. Now, that ban can be applied generously to the person's family. We've seen through the testimonies, people whose, villages have been banned, which means that all of the people in the village then get a ban. And that's something that's, again, it's built into the system. And so you get this system whereby it's very easy to stop people. And it's very easy also to, use this, the reason of security for anything. Now, I'm obviously not saying that there's no security needs. Of course there are. And it's true that we use bans for very necessary security needs. But it should also be said that people who have gone through the process and received permission and their permits, and they've gone through the checkpoint, have then gone on to carry out terror attacks too. So it doesn't really stop the terror necessarily. And on the other side, you have people who don't necessarily go through the whole process. They don't get a permit, but they enter Israel through a gap in the separation fence, of which there are many, and then carry out a terror attack in Israel. So either way, it's not really doing, if the reason for the permit regime is to keep us safe, which is what we're always told, then there are definitely some very, very big holes in that argument. Apart from the fact that you wouldn't need any kind of permit to carry out a terror attack in the West Bank. And a lot of the terror attacks do happen in the West Bank.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, as well as a question that I was going to ask anyway, but this feels like a good lead-in point to it. Some of the testimonies in the report point out that the permit regime can be manipulated into collective punishment very, very easily, and that's a little bit of what you were just talking about. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that works on a functional level and the ways that it sort of takes shape in ways that we might look at as corruption, favoritism, in addition to that?
Okay, so the thing about the permit regime is that I, as a soldier or an officer, had at the same time both very little discretion and a lot of discretion about who gets permits. I had very little discretion because all of the applications that I received, and I received often hundreds every day, would go through this computer process. And the computer was built to, all I had to do was basically to type in the Palestinian's ID number and see that all of the documents were there that they had to give me. And then the computer would run that person through the criteria for that specific permit and determine whether they are eligible or not eligible for the permit that they were requesting. So in that sense, I didn't have very much discretion. On the other hand, I had the ability as a very low-ranking officer to decide what order I put these ID numbers into the system in. Now, that could mean that someone could wait a few days. That means that I could decide that someone could go straight through the system very quickly. And that was, again, something that we used. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't just on the whims of an officer. It was something that we made sure to use. And that meant that people who we wanted to keep close to us, like Palestinian officials at all levels of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian police officers, and all sorts of people, even the cleaner who worked on the Palestinian side of our reception window, I had an interest in keeping him on my side. And therefore, that person was able to give me permit applications, and I would process them. That person didn't have to wait. So that's the kind of discretion that I have as an officer. And as I said, the system also allows us to ban people. So you have the two sides of the coin are that on the one hand, I can give permits very easily to the people who I see fit, or the unit sees fit, or my superiors. And on the other hand, there's the banning system, which is either because the Shin Bet has decided that that person is a threat, or the police, or even within the unit. We had something called Menihat Agam, which is basically the officers within the unit were able to kind of type in about a person that person receives a ban for all sorts of reasons. And that could be done in order to manipulate the reality the way we saw fit. There was one very striking testimony in the collection that we published, which is about a soldier who was in the permit center in the headquarters of the civil administration. And she said that one evening they all were called in, well after working hours. And there was, at this time, there was a hunger strike in prisons led by Palestinian prisoners. And this was obviously not something that the Israeli authorities wanted to deal with. So they made the decision to remove the permits of all of the family members of those prisoners who were on hunger strike in order to stop them from visiting their relatives. And that was just a way that was, I guess, from a security point of view, it's great. We want to apply pressure for them to stop their hunger strike. But if we take a zoom out for a moment, we see that that's basically a tool of collective punishment, and that's something that shouldn't be allowed.
There's a question here coming from one of the participants, which I think is actually very poignant and very deep, and that is whether there's the question is, are there many IDF soldiers sympathetic to the human rights of the Palestinians? And maybe, if I may sort of extrapolate a little bit on the question, does it make a difference what the attitude of the soldier who holds the stamp or whose fingers are on the keyboard? Does it make any difference given the circumstances in which they work, which are occupation?
I'd say it does make a difference on an individual level, because we are the soldiers who are in constant interaction with the Palestinians. And unfortunately, many of the soldiers who I came across were not sympathetic. And from their point of view, and this is something I heard again and again, the Palestinians were the ones who are attacking us. They're our enemies. And then we are the ones who we're being so generous to them. We're giving them permits and we're allowing them to work. And soldiers aren't really told so much about our responsibilities as an occupying power. So from a lot of soldiers' point of view, it's, we're being ridiculously generous and we should tone that down. And then that attitude often came through in the interactions that the soldiers had with the Palestinians, and that racism kind of really came out, and it could be very unpleasant and potentially damaging. But that's on the individual level. On a higher level, I think, as I said, we are soldiers in a system, and our role as soldiers is to follow orders. It's unpleasant to say that, but I realized as a young officer, we're encouraged as officers to sign on for as long as possible, because the unit has invested money into our training and resources and everything. So from their point of view, they wanted us to stay and to sign on more time. And I realized at quite an early stage that there wasn't really any way that I could have an influence, even though that was definitely the idea that I had when I decided to become an officer. I kind of wanted to be a good officer. I wanted to be a good influence on the people around me and be good to the Palestinians. But I realized that the policy is the policy of occupation. The policy is that we rule over them. And no amount of time that I stayed in the army could influence that, because really the problem is with our government and the government policy. And that's something that I could have more of an influence on from a civilian perspective than from within the army.
So there's another question here that I think also really speaks to this conversation, which is there's a point about disinformation and disinformation campaigns and the role that, I'm just going to use the word propaganda, that plays in this. Can you talk a little bit about, what that reality is like for a 22-year-old conscripted soldier who's been drinking the Kool-Aid their whole life, Israel good, military good, we're under threat, etc., choosing to leave their service and to push back against the occupation despite the propaganda and the way that it's written about in history textbooks.
Yeah, I think it's something that we get asked a lot in Breaking the Silence. I happen to grow up abroad, and I went through a very kind of standard Zionist education. And as I said, my idea was that my role was always to defend Israel. I think for many Israelis that feeling is the same from a kind of an Israeli perspective, and and for people who grew up in Israel, it really it makes sense that we have to continue the occupation. It is difficult for a lot of young Israelis who've gone through this education system to come to the conclusion that this isn't right. But I think for a lot of people who go through this process, being in the army and having these interactions and seeing what it's like, there are a lot of people who kind of come to that, there's a crack at a certain point. My crack was when as I said, during that mapping mission, we woke up this family in the middle of the night, and I saw the kids, like very young kids, 6 or 8-year-olds, who we'd just woken up, and I thought to myself, we're not helping by doing this mission. We're definitely not making any of my friends or family living in Israel feel more safe, and that kind of cracked that whole narrative that I'd grown up on. I think for a lot of people, they have a moment like that. And then, yeah, unfortunately, you have to deal with a lot of pushback if you're going to, dare to speak out. And there are unfortunately lots of individuals and organizations in Israel, many of them supported by people in the government or in previous governments, who see their job as making it difficult to speak out about the occupation, or speaking out about what we saw in the army and why we think that what the reality on the ground is today is wrong. And yeah, there's really a whole industry out there of trying to keep voices like ours quiet. But as long as there is an occupation, and as long as soldiers are sent to uphold it, there will be soldiers who come back from that and want to speak out.
There's a follow-up question here that we just got, asking, why hasn't the crack that you experienced, why isn't it more pervasive among other soldiers in the IDF? So we can only ask you questions, obviously, about your experience. But what was your impression, maybe, of the overall atmosphere of around you when you served?
Unfortunately, I don't think that the conclusions that I came to were very widely held. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a very strong kind of system that people go through until they come to the army, and when you come in with that kind of thinking of the Palestinians as the enemy, then it's very difficult to kind of make that switch. For some people, it requires a very specific kind of incident, as it did for me. Some people do have that perspective when they're coming in, and that's why there are soldiers who do break the silence in the end. But unfortunately, I think that for a lot of people, it doesn't happen until later, if at all. Maybe I'll just add to that.
Go ahead.
That you're dealing with people who are different from you. They speak a different language, and there's kind of a whole dehumanization process that we go through to make, like, I heard a lot of the time all sorts of just very unconnected insults about the Palestinians that really had no grounding in reality. And I think that it's very easy to connect to that narrative of the Palestinians are the other, they're kind of terrorists, they're bad people, because we don't really have a common language and we don't have the important interactions that are necessary before we go into the army.
So I know that Max wants to ask you a little bit about breaking the silence, and we should, because it's important. The work you do is very important. But before that, I just see that we kind of go back and forth between nuts and bolts questions and larger picture questions. And there is a question here that I think is important, and again, that has to do with the relationship between the civil administration and the Palestinian Authority, and the type of permits that the civil administration issues for people who are in areas A and B. Let's say, for example, that someone who lives in Nablus or Ramallah wants to travel abroad, or what do they do? How does it apply to building permits? Maybe health, medical treatment, things like that.
Okay, so those are all very big topics. I'll just say that as it concerns traveling abroad, Palestinians don't travel through Ben Gurion Airport as Israelis do. In order to go abroad, Palestinians have to go through the Allenby crossing, which is near Jericho, and then from there to Amman in Jordan, and then from there they fly. And we control, the civil administration, together with the Israel Airports Authority, controls the Allenby crossing, which means that everyone goes through us. I'm not sure to what extent we have to give permission. I'm not sure if that's the case, but we definitely stop the people we don't want traveling abroad, and that's something that we do a lot. We have testimonies in the collection about that. And that's true for all Palestinians, even from Gaza, the people who want to fly abroad, if they don't go through Egypt, which is in a small number of cases, then they have to go on a very small number of organized buses, shuttles from Gaza to the West Bank, and then from there through the Allenby crossing. So we have complete control of Palestinians in that sense. As regards construction permits, that's a whole other area. I didn't deal with it personally while I was in the army, but in Area C, the civil administration has the ability to decide who gets permits approved for building and who doesn't. And again, that's used for political purposes. We see through the testimonies that the civil administration is very concerned with what's called the battle for Area C. And the battle for Area C basically means that we want to make sure that the Palestinians don't have a foothold in Area C and the Israelis are able to build there. So that means that we approve a lot more for the Israelis than for the Palestinians. And we use our power to do demolitions of Palestinian structures. I think the statistic I saw was there's eight times more demolitions of unapproved Palestinian structures as Israeli structures. At the same time,
I see that we're stuck again. We've had this before with Joel. We'll give him a little bit more of time to adjust his Wi-Fi and see if he can come back online. If he doesn't, we're just going to ask the chair of our board, James Klutznick, who just joined us, to say a few words. So I'm going to stall just a little bit.
I'd like to point out really quickly, because I know it's come up in the Q&A a couple of times, there is a link to the full report in the Q&A, and also there's a link to it on our social media leading into this. And if you literally Google Breaking the Silence COGAT report, it'll be like their website will be the first thing that comes up, because I know a couple of people are out there looking for it right now.
Good. So I think we're reaching the end of our webinar. I think it was fascinating. There's obviously a lot more to learn about this issue. And as Max pointed out, the report is very rich with details and worthwhile looking into. Joel has rejoined us. So what I'll do is before I hand it over to Jim, I think we're going to ask you, Joel, just to say a few words about breaking the silence, about what you do, how you do it, what you try to achieve, and how people can help.
I'm very sorry about my internet problems. Breaking the Silence is an organization of former soldiers who served in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, and have done since the Second Intifada until today. We collect testimonies of soldiers who describe what military rule looks like, what day-to-day life looks like from the point of view of the soldiers, what the orders are, what we're told to do as soldiers, and you know, the most basic things that help perpetuate the situation today. And we do so in order to make a very clear statement that we believe that the occupation is not good and it should end. It's not good for us as Israelis, and it's definitely not good for the Palestinians. So far, we have over 1,300 testifiers in our community. And we use those testimonies in order to do educational activities like this one, or like putting out the booklet that we just published. And we bring people on tours to Hebron and the South Hebron Hills, basically to try to get the message out to whoever's willing to listen. And I think if people want to know the way that they can help or be involved, it's very important, first of all, to get to know the reality. Read the testimonies on our website, I hope that we can put a link here, actually, of the booklet.
Yes,
that we just put out. And when you're next in Israel, Palestine, join us for a tour. And then you can use that knowledge to be able to pressure the people that you're able to pressure, talk to people, because really we believe that this needs to be a mass movement to end the occupation.
I highly recommend those tours. I've been on one of them and it was fascinating. So very highly recommended. There are many more questions in the Q&A that we won't be able to address. What I'd like to ask you to do is, if there is a question that is particularly important for you to get an answer for, email it to me. You can find my email address on our website, and just email it to me, and I will either address it to Joel or just, if I know the answer it myself. As we typically do before we leave, just a few words from the chairman of our board, James Klutznick.
Thank you, Ari, and Max and Joel. We salute you for your bravery, you and your colleagues. When we go to Israel on a number of occasions, your colleagues have joined us in the West Bank and given us tours, and I would recommend that as you've suggested, as Ori has suggested. You know, what's interesting is excuse me, I'm going to take more than a few words here, because I think there's a very interesting aspect to this. Joel coming as making Aliyah, coming from a Western country like we are, and we have many Americans who do the same thing. The sickness starts at home. You have particularly, and you'll excuse me if I say it, and certainly you can open your line and speak back to me if you want, but you come from a very strong Zionist background, from a religious background. Not all Jews do that, particularly out of this country, but there are ones who do it in the same manner. So the sickness starts at home, wherever the home is. The United States contributes many Jewish youth to Israel in the same manner. I'm sure you've had them as colleagues and have met them. my concern, and Ori's heard this, I don't know if Max has ever heard this. I speak about the Sunday school kids here in the United States. It started, I'm 79 years old. So this started for me back in the 50s. And my colleagues, who are the older generation now today, foolishly support this nonsense to the extent that just in the last week, we lost one of our best congressmen, Andy Levin, who introduced the Two-State Solution Act into the House of Representatives in the United States, which is an indication of what's happening here in the United States, that the younger people in the United States are wise to what's going on there, as you portrayed. It's the people my generation who are creating a big problem, and we'll be leaving the stage soon, maybe not soon enough at this point. We just damaged one of the best congressmen we could have by what our political system has done in combination with some very clever people on our side. And I don't use clever as a compliment in this case. So I would say to those who are listening in, who are our supporters and your supporters, Joel, through us, we've got to keep this fight up. We've got to stop the apex of this world and the poison that they are now spreading. And you know the source of it because you've lived the source of it now. But I thank anybody who's listening in, willing to support you, willing to support us, and encourage you to do so more so, because now this has become very critical. The United States is so important to trying to solve this problem. And you can see our politicians, our non-Jewish politicians particularly, are stymied by this. They get frozen in time, as we can see, even the best of them. And our current administration, which I think we need very badly here, and we're supporting very strongly here, has not been able to operate as strongly as it should. Or he's written a good piece about that today, that we're not acting quickly enough. And it's because of the influence of our community here. So thank you very much for coming on and giving us the straight scoop about this. And I encourage everybody to support you and to support us at this critical time now. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Max and Joel. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks. And I'd like to remind everyone that the recording of this video will be on YouTube, audio will be on our podcast. And with that, thanks again to everyone who joined.